What's up, everybody? Chris Pennell here, and we're going over my quarterback tier rankings for week 7 of the fantasy football season. If you do enjoy today's video, make sure you leave a like down below. Subscribe to the channel if you haven't yet done so. If you have any questions about your own players or your own start-sit decisions, leave them down below. I'm more than happy to get back to you. All right, so before we get into it, I do have to mention there's some bye weeks this week, so it will affect rankings a little bit. So we're going to be without the Carolina Panthers, the Houston Texans, the New York Jets, Tennessee Titans, Dallas Cowboys, and the Cincinnati Bengals. So not a ton of fantasy relevance there. Obviously, Joe Burrow being the big one. And then we're also going to be without CJ Stroud. For those of you that picked him up and are starting him week in, week out, you cannot do that this week. So you might be hurting a little bit for the waiver wire this weekend at quarterback. But let's start with the S tier first. And I have 5 guys that are going to crack this list. And I think it's probably the 5 you would expect. Number 1 for me is going to be Patrick Mahomes in this spot versus the Los Angeles Chargers. This should be a pretty good game. I do expect some fireworks. It features a 48.5 point over under, which is the second highest on the entire slate this weekend, only behind that Philadelphia Eagles and Miami Dolphins game, which is sitting at 51.5. And surprise, surprise, you're probably going to see those 2 quarterbacks from those teams show up here in the S tier. But Mahomes is going to have to be my number 1. Not only is he the best quarterback in football, he draws the absolute best matchup in fantasy football right now, as the Los Angeles Chargers are giving up the most fantasy points per game to the quarterback position, over 300 passing yards per game, roughly around 24 fantasy points. Dak Prescott, who's been in turmoil this year and just had a great game versus them, although the rushing touchdown did help a bit, but he still had a pretty big game. So Mahomes, fire him up as your QB1 this week. Number 2 for me, it's a really close between the other 4, but Jalen Hurts with his rushing upside is always going to give him the safest floor possible and an extremely high ceiling as well. And I just love this game for fantasy purposes. So if you have skill position players in this game, fire them up. Highest total on the entire week at 51.5, only a 2-point spread. Should be back and forth, and the Eagles have the second best implied team total at 26.75. And if you're not someone that looks at Vegas implied totals when making fantasy decisions in general, whether it be for DFS or for season long, it's a mistake. I mean, obviously you're playing these guys no matter what, but if you have a low-end flex player that you're deciding between 2 players, and one has obviously a decent chance of volume and it's going to be pretty close, look for the guy with the higher implied team total. There's just more scoring equity there. And I'm not saying it's the end all be all, but it's definitely something that should help sway you in the right decision. But Miami, another good matchup, their bottom half in the league versus fantasy quarterbacks. And then on the flip side of this game, we're going with the other quarterback from Miami. We're going to roll with Tua here as my QB3 on the week. Like I said, I just love this game in general. And when you have Tyreek Hill and Jalen Waddle to throw the ball to, it just makes life really easy. He's averaging over 300 passing yards per game, nearly 2.5 passing touchdowns, 9.5 yards per attempt, and over a 70% completion percentage. The one downside with Tua is that he just does not run the ball. We're talking 3.5 rushing yards per game, but quarterback rating, just accuracy, everything about him has been excellent. And his skill position players and the way Mike McDaniels has this offense humming, hard not to like him. Plus, Philly is bottom half in the league when it comes to fantasy quarterbacks, bottom 10 to be exact. So fire up Tua with confidence. After that, it's going to be tight here between Justin Herbert and Josh Allen. I just hate New England Patriots games, but with Allen having rushing upside, I think I have to roll him here at number 4 above Justin Herbert. Although I will say, I wish we saw some more rushing upside from Josh Allen this season. We're only seeing around 20 yards per game. Still always going to be a threat around the goal line. And we know the Patriots team just overall this year has just looked so dreadful. But still defensively, their games are just so ugly and boring. They're just not giving up too many fantasy points to quarterbacks. Only at 13.4 this season, which ranks 5th best, and 217 passing yards. Obviously, the Bills' offense, I think, can overpower this defense. And when you have a guy like Stephon Diggs out there to make magic happen, I'm not going to be too concerned about it. But I wouldn't say this is my absolute favorite matchup in the world for Josh Allen. But at the same time, at number 5 here, we have Justin Herbert, who also draws a pretty bad matchup. Now, I think this can be a pretty high-scoring game, and the Chargers' offense, I think, is good enough to be able to put up points versus this KC defense. But they've been pretty stingy so far this year. They're actually allowing less than 200 passing yards per game, 14.2 fantasy points per game, which is 6th fewest, which is right behind the New England Patriots. And they're on the road in KC and Arrowhead, which is never really an easy place to play. But with how many times the Chargers throw the ball per game, which is around 35, and you have a guy like Keenan Allen out there and just plenty of weapons, I think Herbert still has to belong in the S tier here, even though the matchup isn't great. But I do think they will be playing from behind here, which is according to the game script here, as they are 5.5 point dogs on the road. So I do like that. Wish he was in the dome. He's borderline A S tier for me, but I put him in the S tier just to make the top 5. And then moving down to our A tier here, it definitely feels like a big drop off. Although Lamar Jackson, who's going to be my first option here, he comes in at number 6. With his rushing upside, it's always going to make him fantasy relevant. Not the greatest matchup in the world versus Detroit. They rank pretty much mid-pack, 14th versus quarterbacks this season, only 17 points per game. But it's the rushing upside. We're talking over 50 rushing yards per game, which is like a built-in passing touchdown floor, plus a little bit, nearly 6 designed runs per game. Plus, we're always going to get those scrambles. So Lamar is going to get you about 200 passing yards per game. You just have to hope the touchdowns are there, but it's certainly possible. So he comes in at number 6 because of his floor. And coming in at number 7, you might think I'm a bit too high on him this week because it does feel weird having him up in the rankings. Like the A tier feels fine, but I actually have him at number 7. And it's Geno Smith of the Seattle Seahawks. I realize he hasn't had an amazing start to the season, was great last year, but it's hard not to like any of the Seahawks this week versus this Arizona Cardinals defense, who's just honestly awful. They rank 20th versus quarterbacks, which means they're allowing the 5th most points per game, about 270 and 1.5 touchdowns. And like I said, Geno hasn't exactly been great. They're throwing the ball less than 30 times per game, only getting 1 touchdown, 234 passing yards, but this is definitely a great matchup for it. And they currently have a 26-point implied team total. They're 7.5-point favorites. That is one of the highest team totals on the entire slate. So I love Geno and I love all of his pass catchers. Moving on to number 7. It's a huge question mark right now. I don't know if he's going to play or not, but it's Deshaun Watson. Yes, this is probably a bit too high, but there's not that many great quarterback spots this week. And if he does play, the last time we saw him on the field, he tore up that Tennessee Titans pass defense, 27 for 33, right around 300 yards and a couple of touchdowns. So if he's healthy versus Indianapolis Colts pass defense, which is truly not good, 26 versus quarterbacks this year, he's got Amari Cooper, Elijah Moore out there. He should be able to at least get you 250 and 2, and always going to offer you a little bit of rushing upside as well, as he's averaging close to 30 rushing yards per game, which is nearly a passing touchdown floor built in, just what he can do with his legs. So if Deshaun Watson ends up playing, I realize he is going to have a nagging injury, but I feel like they're not going to get him out there until he's good to go. So if he's back, I like Deshaun. If not, obviously you can just erase him from memory here. And then at number 9, we have Matthew Stafford going up against the Pittsburgh Steelers. And while it's not my absolute favorite matchup, they're still bottom half in the league when it comes to fantasy quarterbacks. Nearly 18, 19 fantasy points per game and 270 passing yards. The main thing here is that the running position is a bit depleted in this offense. Kyren Williams in a walking boot, Ronnie Rivers out several weeks. So we have Zach Evans back there and Royce Freeman. And while I think Zach Evans is a fine streamer this week, and over on DFS, he has been priced on DraftKings, so I think he'd be fine. But for fantasy football purposes, that should lead to, hopefully, a heavier passing attack, and Cooper Kupp's fully healthy, and he's crushing defenses the first 2 weeks. Get Puka Nacua out there, who's still going to do some damage, even though he did drop a touchdown last week. But they should be able to do fine versus the Pittsburgh Steelers. So I'm fine with Stafford starting him up. And they throw the ball a ton. We're clocking close to 35 times per game, which I will take that. And Stafford's been really good this season, just not really getting the touchdowns. But passing yardage-wise, he's been fine, roughly around 280 passing yards per game, and been over 300 passing yards in just about half his games so far this season. And then rounding out the A tier, it doesn't feel good doing it, but I'm going to put Brock Purdy in here. Obviously, a very down game versus the Cleveland Browns. The weather wasn't great. And honestly, that's one of the absolute toughest matchups you can ask for. But we get a much better spot here on Monday Night Football versus the Minnesota Vikings on the road. So we're in the dome, don't have to worry about any weather. While Purdy's not a guy that typically passes for big yardage, he can be a bit efficient in the touchdown market. And it looks like CMC might be pretty doubtful for this game. So if he happens to miss, obviously that's kind of sucky because you can't get all the dump off points from him for Brock Purdy and takes one to the end zone. But there's always the chance where these rushing touchdowns end up leading to Brock Purdy short touchdowns if they get around the goal line. But either way, I just like the matchup versus Minnesota. We don't have to worry about any weather. And it's always fun to have a Monday night sweat. And it's a good matchup. So not going to get too picky here. They're averaging nearly 20 fantasy points per game to quarterbacks. The Minnesota Vikings ranking 21st versus the position. This is a good offense. CMC being out would take a hit, but you still got Brandon Ayuk out there. Hopefully Deebo Samuel's fine, and you have one of the best tight ends in George Kittle. So if we can get 250 and 2 out of Brock Purdy, I think I'll take it. But there's always upside for more too. Moving on to our B tier, so outside of the top 10. So hopefully you have better options than these guys, but if you're in a 12-team league, and unfortunately if you're in a league like me where I have an 18-teamer and I have Zach Wilson and Deshaun Watson as my quarterbacks, you are truly hoping Deshaun Watson starts, because if that's not the case, I am probably going to end up having to start like a Taysom Hill in my quarterback spot, so that's just a downright disaster. So don't be like me. Do not play in 18-team leagues. It is not fun at this point of the season. But we're going to go with Sam Howell here, who's really only had one bad game this season. It was like 4 or 5 points versus the Buffalo Bills. Other than that, he's pretty steady, right around 20 fantasy points. He offers you a little bit of rushing upside. And the matchup versus Atlanta, it's not amazing, but it's not bad either. It's pretty much mid-pack. They're 17th versus quarterbacks, allowing roughly 17 fantasy points per game. And while it's kind of annoying for the receiving options in this offense, because he really spreads the ball around, there's still some decent guys out there. Terry McLaurin, Jahan Dotson, Curtis Samuel, Logan Thomas, Antonio Gibson out of the backfield. Even Brian Robinson gets involved. So it's hard to pick his receiving options, but Sam Howell himself was going to get all those points. And like I said, he can run the ball a little bit too. So firmly in play as a QB1 this week. And rounding out our QB1s with the top 12 here, it's going to be Trevor Lawrence for me. Now, I'm not sure if he's going to end up playing or not. So he's a bit of a question mark like Deshaun Watson. Thing is, though, the matchup's not very good either, but I would have a hard time sitting him unless you obviously have better options, which if you drafted Lawrence, I feel like you wouldn't unless you picked up like a Brock Purdy or a Matthew Stafford or Sam Howell off waivers. That is certainly possible, but assuming you don't, it's a rough spot. They're allowing like 14.5 points per game, 7 fewest points allowed per game to the fantasy quarterback position, but the weapons that Trevor Lawrence has, it's just hard to pass up and it's hard to sit him. I mean, you have Calvin Ridley, Evan Ingram, Travis Etienne out of the backfield, Christian Kirk, who's obviously been very good. We'll see if Zay Jones ends up playing or not. But like I said, tough matchup and a very low total here. They're on the road in New Orleans, 38.5 point over under, which is one of the lowest on the entire slate. And the Jaguars come in with a 17.75 implied team total as 3-point dogs. So not super encouraging there. But if Lawrence is good to go, I'm not going to sit him, but I'm also not going to be excited about it either. Then up next, we have Jared Goff coming in at QB 13. Hopefully you don't have to start him, but if you do, this offense is good enough to just be able to support points for the quarterback position because you have Amon-Ra St. Brown, who's always going to be a go-to option. You have Jameson Williams, who caught a bomb last week. You have Josh Reynolds, who's been solid this year. Marvin Jones plays a little bit, but you're never too excited about it. But the thing is, no David Montgomery, and Jahmyr Gibbs' status is still up in the air. Now, I think he's trending in the right direction to play, but even then, that's just another passing option in the pass game for him because we know Jahmyr Gibbs is an excellent pass-catching running back. And we also have Sam Laporta, one of the better tight ends in football. He's already established that super early in his rookie season. So if you're in a pinch, Jared Goff is definitely not a bad option despite the matchup not exactly being great versus Baltimore. They've allowed the fewest points per game at the quarterback position. But if you have a bye week this week and you're hurting or you've lost Anthony Richardson or you have Deshaun Watson, he ends up not playing, Jared Goff is 100% fine as a streaming option, even though the matchup sucks. And then a matchup that does not suck this week, it's Jordan Love. I don't think he's very good. I realize the touchdowns have been there this year, but you can't ask for a better matchup than the Denver Broncos. Now, like I said, Jordan Love's not the best guy out there, 216 passing yards per game, but is averaging over 1.5 passing touchdowns per game this season. But a 55% completion percentage, I believe he's near tops in the league in some of the bad throw percentages this year. But the Broncos are allowing the second most points per game in the quarterback position, 23.2, 285 passing yards, nearly 2.5 passing touchdowns. He's got some decent options to get the ball to out there. I mean, especially Christian Watson, we know the upside with him, although he gets injured a lot. Romeo Doubs out there and Jaden Reed. So I'm fine with Jordan Love as a streamer, definitely a plus matchup. And rounding out our B tier, it's not a pretty play with no Justin Jefferson these days, but Kirk Cousins, they still throw the ball a ton. And he still has good weapons. Jordan Addison's good. KJ Osborne's not terrible. TJ Hawkinson's one of the best tight ends in football. So he throws the ball close to 37 times per game. Like, I'll take it. There should be a positive game script here. And we're playing at home in the Dome. And the Kirk Cousins sucks in primetime thing, I think that needs to be put to bed. Like, he does not suck in primetime. Like, the past several primetime games, Cousins has went off. So I don't know if people are still scared about that or not. But, I mean, look it up. Like, even the Saturday 1 p.m. games, but I'm going to count that as a primetime game because it was an island game, like around the holidays. Like, he's done very well. Just look at the past games for him. So not that it means anything. I just know people get worried about that, but tough matchup versus the 49ers, but I do like the potential game script here. They are 6.5 point dogs at home. I hate the low total, but I don't have them in the A tier or the S tier or anything. He's no back end of the B tier, so I'm not like super excited about it. Hopefully you have better options than Kirk Cousins this week because no Justin Jefferson really kills his upside, but the amount of times they throw the ball, which if they're trailing this game probably should be close to 40, he could probably just walk his way into 250 and hopefully 2 touchdowns. At least we hope. Now moving on to the C tier, if you're in this situation this week, I'm going to wish you the best of luck. It's probably not going to end up being great for you. I'm not going to spend a lot of time going through these quarterbacks, but I do think Russell Wilson's fine versus the Green Bay Packers. Wilson honestly has not been too bad this year. If you played him on Thursday night versus the Kansas City Chiefs, obviously you're pretty disappointed, but the weather was pretty bad for that game. It was really windy, which hurts the downfield ball, which Russell Wilson's pretty good at. Other than that, though, I mean, he's been fine as like a QB2 this year. I think he came into last week as QB8. Obviously, not this week after that poor performance, but I think Russ is fine in a pinch this weekend. Coming in next is Josh Dobbs, just because I like this game overall. And while Geno Smith is definitely the preferred option in this one, he does offer you a little bit of rushing upside. So you can get a free quarterback that runs the ball a little bit and you are in dire need for one. It's not the worst way to go this week. Seattle ranking 22nd versus quarterbacks this season, allowing close to 300 passing yards per game. Dobbs throws the ball typically around 30 times per game for 200 passing yards, but we do get 31 yards on the ground per game with 4 designed runs. So we'll take the floor there. Not excited about it, but he is there. Daniel Jones, another ugly option, but again, he does run the football and he is facing Washington, who has allowed some pretty decent games to quarterbacks this year. Desmond Ridder, while it wasn't a great NFL real-life performance, still got there for fantasy purposes last week. So if you want to go with Daniel Jones because he can run the ball a little bit, we'll see if he ends up playing. Tyrod Taylor wasn't absolutely awful last week, but if Jones is healthy and good to go, I'm assuming he's going to be back in the starting role. And we're getting really ugly here, but our last 2 spots, they're pretty much the same exact plays this week. Their numbers are very similar. We have Derek Carr and Baker Mayfield. Derek Carr draws a little bit of a better matchup. I just hate Thursday night football games, but Jacksonville does rank 27 versus quarterbacks, allowing right around 280 passing yards per game and close to 21 fantasy points. He's got good weapons in Michael Thomas and Chris Olave, so Carr's there if you, I don't know what situation you're in where you have to play Derek Carr, but I mean, I guess I'd understand it. There's some bad things that can happen out there injury-wise. And then Baker, not excited about it. Tampa is throwing the ball less this season, which no surprise with no Tom Brady. Under 30 times per game this year. Tougher matchup versus Atlanta, allowing less than 200 passing yards per game, but he does round out the top 20. And if you need anybody from the D tier with the quarterbacks that we have left, good luck. You probably lost this week. With that being said, that's all I got for today's video. I hope you enjoyed. And if you did, leave a like on your way out. Subscribe to the channel if you haven't yet done so. Wish you all the best of luck, and I'll see you all next time.